All right, everybody. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and look at understanding how to set up an effective and a simple grid layout. We're going to understand what's technically possible. We're going to go into so much details. We're going to start off by looking at Fold Money first and see how they've set everything up. And I'll talk about what are the main problems that they have in terms of how they set up their grid layout. Second, we're going to look at some benchmarking and we're going to look at other products and see some general practices, some things that to do, some things that you should not do, and also look at some things that are completely outdated, right? There were a lot of rules that people were following many years ago and all of that is sort of outdated right now and the rules are a lot simpler right now, so I'm going to show you all of that. I'm going to quickly show you all the tabs that are there. And of course, as you can see, all of this is fake data, so please don't look at the math. It will not make any sense. But anyway. So this is their main dashboard. You've got, like a weird layout over here. You've got this empty space over here. You've got a list of all transactions on the right side. You've got, three columns over here, but it's sort of like 4 columns because you have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's sort of a weird layout and structure. If you go to transactions, also, this is obviously a simpler layout, but when you tap on something, you get this panel on the side and then you tap on expand and you've got like a bigger version and this has its own internal column, right? Quite unique and different than what we saw on the home. And then you have credit cards. Credit cards, I think, is a simple and straightforward one. Let's understand how this is sort of set up. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is that I'm actually using my monitor to record this. So this screen that you're seeing is on a display of 1920 pixels wide, which is a standard monitor screen size, right? So from left to right, the size is 1920 pixels, right? But as you can see over here, the elements are not touching the edge of the screen. There is some gap, all right? Now, before we go into the details, this layout that they have is super weird, right? Because you've got a lot of this negative space at the bottom, which is empty space, looks quite ugly. And you've got this column which sort of scrolls past this area. And you've got a smaller card and then you've got like a bigger card, and here also you have like some sort of a column, right? So there's so much going on and seems to be no symmetry over here. And all of this is just like a random Tetris game. You put pieces in places that you have space, right? None of this is well thought through. And we're going to look at some benchmarking and we're going to see how it's usually done and what are some behaviors or patterns that we can identify. All right. So I've taken a couple of screenshots from Mobbin and we're going to go through them one by one. Now, if you see over here, this has a similar layout to Fold Money, as in that you have some space on the left side and on the left side and on the right side over here. And they have a simple layout, right? So they technically have a 2-column layout and one is a smaller card and then the other one is a larger card. Overall, you can see some sort of a visual symmetry over here. It doesn't look really that out of place. Here's another one. Here, this is much more of a complex product. So they have a complete section for a sidebar. And then here also you have a 2-column layout. Typically, it's a 2-column layout. Although here the sizes or the widths of this is not the same. So I think, this is not really a great example to show. There's a lot of layouts here as well. But I think essentially you can see some sort of visual symmetry over here because this is sort of the main area. And then you have this secondary area, which is sort of scrolling past the rest of this content over here. And even though this is not a good example, they're making use of the entire width of the screen. Then you have this one. This one is a little nicer and simpler. They've just followed a simple 2-column layout approach and they've tried to fit everything within that. Great, no problems over here. Then you have Hotjar. Again, simple 2-column layout. You have this sidebar which can collapse and open. It doesn't really matter. And I would not really consider this as 4-column. I've still considered this as 2-column. And even though you have 4 boxes over here, there is some sort of visual symmetry, right? Here's another one. Here again, even though all of these boxes are not on the same, baseline, this acts as its own column and this acts as its own column. And this one is obviously more primary in nature. This is secondary in nature. This is still technically a 2-column layout, just that the first column is a lot larger. And again, we can see some sort of visual symmetry, right? Here you have another one. Here they have a 3-column layout for everything. And here's like another version, another screen for the same product. And over here, they have a little bit of a different approach over here. this area, this box is a bit bigger than this one, but it's still falling under that sort of 2-column layout. Although technically this one is breaking, but it's fine. There is some sort of visual symmetry. It doesn't really look out of place. I can still focus on information that I need, right? It's not visually misleading. Here's another one. Here again, you've got sort of a 2-column layout. This one is a lot larger than this one, but this is fine. Everything is sitting in a nice box, right? And here is Shopify. Here you've got like a 3-column layout, so everything is its own individual box. And here's another one. Even though this is following multiple columns, so this is 4-column and then you have 3-column, you can see some sort of visual hierarchy. Here again, probably this also could have been 4 columns, and it's very easy to make it into a 4-column layout. But yeah, but overall, the most important thing to see is that it's okay to break apart from your regular rule. So for example, here they're breaking apart over here by making this one larger. Here they're breaking by adding multiple smaller rows, I would say technically, in a 2-column layout, right? Here they're not making the size of this the same. The width of this is different, but at the same time, it's fine because all of this looks visually symmetrical and organized to an extent, right? So this is pretty much exactly what we want to do, right? Now, let's try to understand how these screens could have been constructed. Now, I'm not going to be showing you how all of these screens are constructed, but I'm going to give you an overall idea, and then we're going to look into the details of Fold Money. So, if you see over here, what designers usually do is they usually define a maximum width if they don't have a side panel. So in this case, there's no side panel. So here, they define a maximum width and all the content will be fit inside that. So in this case, I don't know what the maximum width is, but there is some sort of a maximum width and all the content is just going to fill the space, sort of like how we know how to use auto layout. And here, what they usually do is typically they take one element and they define a maximum width, and they take another element and then they let that fill the container. So for example, if they took this card and they said this needs to have a width of 300 pixels, this will have a fixed width, and then this will sort of stretch depending on how much ever space is there, right? Now that's one way of doing it. There are multiple ways of doing it where you can put percentages, right? So this could be 2 times the size of this. So you can do basically math or fractions as we call it, and I'm going to give you an example of that as well. So that's one example. Here, this definitely is going to be a fixed width. And here again, this middle area is going to be one section and that's going to fill the container. And then this again would be a fixed width, right? And inside that, they would pick either of these two, give that a fixed width, and then the rest would scale. And I'm obviously going to show you how this works in Fold Money as well, right? Here it's pretty simple. Here they're just a 2-column layout and it's going edge to edge. So, no problem with that, right? So that's pretty much how it's done. And even if you see over here, you have that gap over here. So what they've done is that this has a fixed width. So this one is taking up this entire area. And whatever balance is available, they've defined a fixed width over here. Now, sometimes what people also do is instead of defining a fixed width, they will actually let it fill the container, right? So they will say how much ever space is available in this, beige color area, this content should fill. But they might add some inner padding over here to restrict them, right? And there are benefits of doing that. Similarly over here they might have some padding over here so that the content over here is in that area. And this is basically filling the entire container. Even though there might not be a fixed width, this area is filling the entire container and there is some padding that's moving it inside, right? So now let's look at Fold Money and see how they have done it. Now to see it, what you can do is you can right click and you can choose inspect. Now you can do this on any website out there. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to 1920. This is the width of my browser, right? Now, the first thing I will do is I'm just going to show you how it responsively behaves, right? So as you can see, this is 1920. And as I move in, nothing is changing. Everything is being the same size as it is. And after a certain point, you can see that it breaks into a smaller area, all right? And then it breaks one more time, all right? And here you can see everything is resizing, all right? And here again, it broke. So here it was 2-column and now it's all 1 column. And then you've got this, and here completely it breaks. Now this is fine that we are entering into landscape mobile territory, and Fold Money is not supposed to support that. So that's okay, right? If you can support a tablet for products like this, it's totally fine. You don't have to solve for mobile, right? It's okay if it breaks because nobody is opening this on their mobile phone, right? So it doesn't matter. Now, as you can see, if we were to calculate how many times that there was a change, we will know how many breakpoints they have had, right? And breakpoints basically define sizes at which there is going to be a change in the layout, right? So this is our usual one. If I set this back to 1920, so we have 1, and let's go here. We have 2, all right, and 3, all right, and 4, yeah, right? So there are 4 different layouts. Now the question is, do we need 4 different layouts? And most of the time, you don't really need 4 different layouts. You can just get away with even 2 or 3. And the more breakpoints you have, the more you're complicating for yourself. And if you are required to make 4 breakpoints, that means you have a very poor layout and structure, right? And this unnecessarily complicates things for engineers quite a bit, and this can easily be simplified. And if I go back to the benchmarking over here, right, you can see over here that it's going to be very rare that if we shrink the width of this, that this will break into too many pieces, right? It's just that the width of this is going to be smaller. So typically there might be just 2 breakpoints over here, right? One would look like this, and the other one where this card would go underneath this card, right? Here again, you might have maybe 2 or 3. Here it wouldn't make sense to have 4, all right? Here, this definitely I think would be just 2. So this would be 1, and the second one would be where you have all cards one below the other, right? So I think all of these are quite simpler in nature, right? Even this one, this layout can sustain for a very large size, all right? Even if you bring down to tablet, it does not have to change. And that's why all of these layouts are good standard patterns, because they don't have too many breakpoints. So let's get started here. So I'm going to start off by setting this to 1920. Now, this is probably one of the most important things for you to learn as a designer. And it's very critical because once you start building web apps and you start building web products, it's important to understand how all of this works, because you have to learn how to speak with engineers and help engineers, right? So the first thing you want to do is you want to click on this button, which basically helps you select items over here, all right? And the respective code comes up over here. Now, we don't have to look at the code per se. We just have to look at this section, which has all the properties, all right? So I'm just going to move this aside, and we can see this. Okay. So I'm going to start off by trying to find the main parent section. I'm going to ignore the header for now. All right. We're going to look at this section. So as I hover, you can sort of see some sort of a section. All right. So I think if I hovered over here, I could see this. So this, as you can see, is called main. And I think this is the entire thing, and everything is inside this. So if I click on this, and if you come down, let's sort of see the properties, right? So you've got margin left, margin right. Now, margin is basically the orange area that you see over here. And even though it says auto, there is a value over here. And the reason that's there because if I reduce the size of this, you can see that the value also reduces over here. All right. And what auto basically means is that the designer or developer hasn't really set what these values are. And the reason that's happening is because there is a maximum width that is defined, all right? And I'm going to show that to you. So if I go to 1440 over here, or let's actually do 1920, right? That's where we were. Choose 1920, all right? If I come down over here, you can see that there is a maximum width of 1536 pixels, all right? And if you see over here, it's 1536. So this entire blue area, as you can see over here, it's sort of touching the edge, is 1513 pixels. So the maximum width that this web app can have is 1536 pixel. And anything beyond that, and because my screen size is 1920, which is much bigger than 1536, you have this extra gap. And this is pretty much how all web products are designed. All right, so now if we come to Figma, I've already set up these layouts, and I'm going to show you that how it's done and help you understand how these sections are constructed. So as you can see, they have a maximum width of 1536, right? So if you see over here, this is my frame size, which is 1920 pixels, all right? If I show you, you can see it's 1920, all right? And I've just taken a screenshot, and the width of this entire section is 1536 pixels, right? Now, once we have this, we need to understand how the rest of the areas are sized out. So we're going to start off with this section over here. So if I click on this accordion, you can see under this, I have two sections. So one section I have on the left side and one section I have on the right side. All right. So we can look at this one first. So if I click on this section, you can see that this has a maximum width of 320 pixels. All right. So this is 320 pixels. So if I come back to Figma, I can see that this has a fixed width. So here we have this column, which has a width of 320 pixels. All right. Now, another thing to note here is that when I click on this main section, all right, you can see this purple line, right? If I hover, you can see that purple line. Now that purple line is usually a gap that is defined. So if we come down over here, we should be able to find some sort of a gap, all right? And you can see over here, the gap is set to 20 pixels, all right? So this gap and that gap is 20 pixels is basically what they have defined. So this is 320 pixels, and then you have 20 pixels of gap over here, all right? So essentially this whole thing is 340. Now we can look at this inner section. So we looked at this section, we look at this section. Now if you see this section doesn't really have a maximum width because this section is filling up the entire container. So if I come here and search for width, all right, you can see that I'm not actually able to see any sort of width that is defined, all right? And that's because no width has been defined. Instead, they have something called as flex, all right? And I'm not going to go into the details of this. It can be quite confusing, but anytime you see something like flex or you see some sort of percentage, that means that it's taking up the entire area, all right? So in order to explain that, if I, for example, take this and if I change this value, let's say from 320 to 420, you can see that this area became bigger and this just shrunk down because it's filling up the entire container, right? So you can also change those values and see how they behave over here. All right, so coming back to Figma, here, this is going to be flex, all right? This entire container, so all of this put together. Now, we're going to see how the rest of this is created. So I'm going to go inside this section, and here you've got three elements. You've got the title, which we can ignore, and then you've got this one section, and then one section underneath. Now, this one is pretty simple. This is just taking up the entire width, so this is fine. What you need to define is this. So if I click on this, and I open the accordion, we see two items, one on the left and one on the right. Now the right one, as you can see over here, if I come down, we should be able to find a maximum width somewhere. And you can see that they have a width of 320 pixels. All right. Now here they defined a width of 320 pixels. But in the previous one, if we see over here, all right, let me try to find that container. Let's close this. Yeah. Here they've defined a maximum width. Now, essentially, this also could just have been width, right? Because this section is never going to shrink down no matter the size, right? This section is always going to be as it is. So they can actually keep this at 320. But if I actually squeeze this down, you can see that this is still being 320, all right? So at every breakpoint, this is always 320. So here they could have actually just said 320 as width and not really max width, all right? So set this back to 1920. All right. And I'm going to open this up over here and we were looking at this one. So this one is, as we had seen before, is width of 320 pixels. So here, this will have a maximum width of 320 pixels or fixed width, or I would say, right? And this area is going to be flexing, which is basically expanding. All right. And so here, we have two fixed width columns, all right? And if anything shrinks, okay, these two will always be 320 pixels. So we can actually see that. So as I shrink this down, all right, you can see, and we could probably see that over here, that this starts shrinking, but by the time this starts shrinking, this area doesn't really responsively shrink, it just suddenly shrinks, right? So if you see over here, this is always being 320 pixels and this one is updating based on the width of the screen. All right, perfect. Now, because we saw that the width of this is 1536 pixel, if I go ahead and set the width of this to 1536 exactly, all right, you can see something weird happens. So instead what I will do is I'm just going to expand this And I'm going to bring this back to 1536 slowly. All right. And here you can see that this is actually touching the edge of the screen. Now, essentially, this is not a good practice. You always want to have that gap over here. So if I come back to our benchmarking examples over here, you always want to have that extra gap on the side, no matter the screen size. And that is always a very good practice to have. You never want to be in a situation like this where it's touching the edge of the screen over here. Now we can actually simulate it and see. So if I click over here, I can actually type in something. So I can say padding, all right? And I can say padding left, and I can say 40 pixels. And as you can see, it added 40 pixels of padding over here, all right? And I can tap again, and I can type in padding and choose right, and also add 40 pixels there, all right? So now, if I scale this, you can see that the width, all right, is still 1536, all right? The maximum width is still 1536, but it has an inner padding of 40. So as you can see here, this blue area is actually 1456, all right, plus 40, plus 40. And so now if I shrink this down to 1536, all right, so if I bring that down to 1536, all right, that 40 pixel padding is going to be there, and this entire section is 1536 pixel. All right. So essentially what this means is you want to start off by identifying what should be the maximum width of the actual content. Do you want the width of the content to be 1536, or do you want the width of the content to be 1456? All right. Now these numbers are quite unique and weird, right? And I'm going to simplify this a lot for a lot of you, right? You don't need to use these complicated numbers, all right? The only thing you need to decide is what should be the width of this content. Now, if you say that the width of this content needs to be 1456, all right? What you then ideally should do is you want to set a maximum width here, all right, of 1456, all right? So I'm going to say 1456. And we will remove this padding over here. So here, you can see that if I go ahead and put in px over here, all right, you can see that now the maximum width is 1456, all right? So life becomes a lot easier once you decide what is it that you want this entire width to be. Now, let's take another example. Now, if I remove this padding, okay, maybe I'll just refresh the screen so that we lose all of this and we start fresh again. All right. Now, I've refreshed all of this, and we're going to now move into the second breakpoint. All right. So we saw the first breakpoint. Now, the second breakpoint starts after 1536 because that was the maximum width available, right? So now, if I reduce this down to 1536, all right, now if I move it 1 pixel, if you can see over here, it's 1536, and I want to move it 1 pixel inside, so 1535, the layout changes. So this is our second breakpoint. All right. Now here what they've done. So if I look at all of those things again, here they've defined a new maximum width of 1336. All right. Now there are actually multiple ways to do this. All right. You can actually define a maximum width of 1336, but you don't want to set maximum widths for every single breakpoint. That is not essentially a good practice to follow. It's actually a very poor practice to follow because then you have so many logics and so many rules to follow that you will end up making a lot of mistakes when you're designing and even when engineers are developing. All right. So essentially the right practice here would be to set this entire section, the entire content area to fill the container, and you go to the section, all right, which is basically the parent section, this area. And here you define a padding value, all right? Instead of saying margin, here you add a padding value. So this main section will have an padding. So then you don't really have to use a max width, all right? So if we come back to Figma and we look at what they have done for smaller breakpoints. So here, this is below 1536 pixels. They have set a maximum width of 1336, which is this entire area. And all of the rest is just following those rules. So this is 320, this is 320, and then this area and the section below is just flexing, right? That is basically what you want to do. Now, essentially, because these two look the same, there is absolutely no difference between both of this. They could have actually used just one breakpoint. They didn't really have to have two breakpoints. They could have just used one breakpoint because both of this looks the same. And the rule you want to follow here is unless your layout is changing, you do not want to introduce another breakpoint, or else that is just very poor development, right? And that is bad design as well. Because in this case, this is 320, this is 320, this is 320, this is 320. This is flexing, this is flexing. So what is the point of having two breakpoints? This could be one breakpoint, right? And what you essentially want to do is if you want to have this gap, so whatever this gap is around 100 pixels, you can just add that 100 pixel as padding or margin, right? So you can still limit it to 1536, but when this shrinks, you can add some inner padding. So essentially, if I were to explain what that means, if I were to take a frame, all right, and let's say I make this 1920 pixels, all right, or at 1920, and then I copy this and paste it over here. Okay. Now the entire content can still be 1536 as we see over here. But if we want it to have this gap, the moment it hits 1536, right? What you can do is if we add a padding of 100 pixels, right? So if I come over here and create a rectangle, all right, and I'm going to set the width of this to 100 pixels, all right, and I'm just going to copy this color, paste that over here, copy and paste, all right. And now I'm just going to add some rules over here, okay. So I can technically run this into an auto layout. So I can put this into an auto layout, and maybe I'm just going to reduce the width of this. Okay. Now, if I shrink this, this is not the behavior that we want. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and set all of this to space between. All right. So now if you see over here, this is basically the behavior that you want. All right. So imagine this is the extra, this is the gap that you have defined for the section, and this is the invisible gap, and the total of that is basically this gap. All right. So if you see over here, the total of this is this gap. And one more thing that we want to do here is this, we want to set that to be fill container. All right. Now it's actually filling the container, right? But we want this to have a maximum width of 1536. So if I come down to width and add a maximum width of 1536, now you can see that this is actually filling the entire area, but it's maxing it out to a width of 1536. So if I set these rules for one single breakpoint, all right, and I come over here and I try to reduce it down for 1536, right? And let's just look at the width over here, right? So I'm going to reduce this down, all right? And if I reduce this down to 1536, all right? Somewhere, let's say 1535, whatever, right? You can see that this area has shrunk down to 1335, right? Which is essentially 1336 that they had decided, right? So this is how you actually want to build the logic. You don't have to create two different breakpoints if the width is not changing. So here, the maximum width was 1536, but here it shrunk down to 1335. Now, if I did not have these two gaps over here, all right, then this would end up taking the entire space. But because those gaps are there, it's actually constricting this area. And if I take this and if I call this 1536, or maybe I can just type this 1536, all right, and I bring this over here, you can see this is pretty much the exact same thing. We just we took one breakpoint and set rules of maximum width and a padding over here. And this is exactly working the way we want it to work, right? And if I, let's say, hide these banners and I'm just reducing the opacity, all right, you can still see that the content is exactly where we want it to be, right? So this implementation is actually very poor, and it's probably, a very old style of implementation. This is not how websites are built today, all right? Awesome. Now let's move on to another breakpoint. So here the width of this maximum width is 1336. All right. So let's move this down to 1335. Okay. So I'm going to reduce this down to 1335, right? So 35, one more pixel, right? So now here the layout changes. So now when the layouts change, it makes perfect sense to introduce a breakpoint. All right. Now here, this is pretty straightforward. This is still 320 pixels, and then this is just taking up the entire width of screens. And now if you see over here, they've added that padding. So if I shrink this, now you can see that the padding that was not there before is there over here. All right. So if you see over here, we should be able to find margin left and margin right of 24 and 24 pixels. So basically we did the exact same thing. Here we defined a width of 100 pixels, and that, got applied here as well. All right. And now for the next breakpoint, if I open up all of this, all right, you can see here that there's this gap of 24 pixels that they added. This is 320. All right. There should also be a small gap of 20 pixels over here. So I'm just going to maybe copy this and paste that over here, right? So this should be 20, right? So you've got this 20, you've got 320, and you've got this flex area, right? Now, typically, if they could have actually just copied this and kept it 100 as well, all right? Or whatever it is, right? They could have kept this to be 100 itself, all right? It's not really a big deal. It's probably up to you. It's not, if this was the entire content area, I don't think this was going to look any bad or weird. I think they could have just kept it. But when you're switching to a breakpoint, you can change the width of this to something else if you want, right? But if I was a designer, I would just keep it 100 over here, right? I don't need to keep it to 20, 24 over here, whatever it is, right? Amazing. Now, finally, if we shrink this down a bit more, we will soon break into another breakpoint. Now, because there is no maximum width that is defined over here, we don't know when this is going to break, all right? So we can only know when we sort of manually shrink this. So I think around 1024, and the moment we hit 1023, we break, all right? So if I come over here to Figma and I open this up, all right? So now all of this is one column. They retained that 24 pixel, all right? And this area is now just going to flex, right? There is no fixed width, all right? So essentially what they could have done is instead of having 4 breakpoints, they could have just had 3 breakpoints. So one breakpoint with 2 rules over here, another breakpoint with just 1 rule with the padding because there is no maximum width, and another breakpoint over here with 1 rule where you have the same 24 pixel padding and you move this section underneath. So if you see over here, transactions were below. And of course, this looks really, really, really bad, as you can clearly see over here. All right. So obviously, the entire layout itself needs to be completely changed. All right. Now, if we look at other screens, all right, for transactions, you can see that they're using the same 24 pixel over here. And here for cards also, they're using 24 pixel. All right. So because this is just taking up the entire width, this one is sort of easier. This sort of behaves very similar to this, where you just have like one section that is just expanding and you have 24 pixels on either sides. Now, just one more thing that I noticed here was that, as you can see, the implementation is not correct because you can see things are clearly breaking over here. So this is obviously very poor implementation on their part. Essentially, these issues should not really happen. Now, one of the most important things to understand here is that they never actually used a 12 column grid ever. The concept of 12 column grids is so rare nowadays that is not how you build websites or web apps like this. It is always depend on fixed values, fractions, or maximum widths. So if you look at this, right, I don't think they made this based on 12 columns. Now, technically they could have, right? So if they split this to 12 columns, maybe this took around 9 columns and this took around 3 columns, right? So this section is 3 columns, this section is 9 columns. That is still possible, but it's very unlikely that they did it and they just decided a maximum width over here, which is 320 or whatever this is, and they just expanded this, right? This is an easier way to do. Now over here as well, here I don't know what layout they used over here. It's pretty hard to figure that out. Here also they don't have to use a 12 column grid. They can just use 2 columns and that's about it, right? So you create 2 containers and you say fill container and you're sorted, right? Same thing over here. This, I don't know how. Maybe this is, again, they probably used a 16 column grid. I don't really know what they did over here. But again, you just can define a maximum width and then let the entire rest of the thing take over, right? So you can use 12 columns if you want, but people don't really use 12 columns all the time, all right? So don't force yourself to use 12 columns if you don't want to, all right? Now, if you actually do want to use a 12 column grid, all right, it's important to understand how to effectively create a 12 column grid because a lot of designers don't know how to set up even a basic 12 column grid. So let me explain. So the first thing you want to do is define the number of columns. So, right, I'm going to type in 12 columns. All right. So we defined 12 columns. Now you can see over here we have 3 other values and you can see one of the value is in red color. Now essentially you don't want it to be in red color because that means that this math doesn't make sense. All right. Because let's take an example. Let's say I make 2 columns for simpler understanding. All right. And I remove all of this. I remove, so the gutter width can be 20, that's fine. And let's say the margin width, I set that to 0. Now, essentially, if we do the math over here, you can see if I've set the maximum width to 960. So this entire thing you can see over here is 960 pixels. So this is 470 plus 20 is 490 and 490 plus 470 is 960. So now the math really works. Now let's use our numbers and see if we could make a 12 column grid and we should apply this 20 pixel gap that we have. So if I go ahead, now set this to 12 columns, I set the margin width gutter width to 20, all right? And if I set the maximum width to 1536, you can see that it creates a problem, all right? Because if we were to do the math, this entire width actually comes up to 1528. It doesn't come to 1536. What this means is you can get 1536, but this column width will end up in decimal numbers, right? Because you have defined this as a fixed variable, number of columns as a fixed variable, maximum width as a fixed variable, but column width is not fixed. 109 is calculated considering all of this. So this will be 109 point something. So if you actually want this to work, all right, and you want this entire width to be 1936, all right, 1536, and you want 12 columns, and you want a gap of 20, the maximum width should actually be 1528. So if I set this to 1528, all right, then the math will make sense. So if I do 109 and multiply this by 12 columns, and we add multiply 20 into 11 times because of the 11 gaps, we will be able to get 1528. That makes sense. Now, let's say you actually want 1536. Let's say you've decided that. Now, if you want it to match, you have to reduce the number of columns or increase the gutter width or reduce it. So if I increase this, all right, if I increase this to 24 pixels, then the math will make sense, all right? So always make sure that when you're selecting a maximum width, be flexible around the gutter width, only then the math will work out. Or if you are very specific about the gutter width, then don't be firm on the maximum width, take whatever it gives you, all right? So this is something that's very important to understand over here. Now, what I have done is I've come up with a very simple, straightforward approach. Right? I don't want too many breakpoints. I don't want too many columns. I don't want too many fixed. I don't want anything. I will set this constraint so that it is going to make my life so easy when designing, and I don't really have to think about so many weird combinations and layouts, right? The idea is to keep things very simple. So what I will do is I will set a maximum width of 860 pixels and 2 columns. That's it. Now, when I was starting this project, I wasn't very sure what the width should be. But as I started designing and I made some iterations and I sort of figured out what would be a good size, I decided on 860 pixels. All right. Now, if this was a much complex product, we would have more space. but this is rather a simple product with simple dashboards and metrics and data points. So this is fine. So if I'm viewing it on a 1920 pixel display, I will have a max width of 860 pixels. Okay. And if I'm on a width tablet, which is around 960 pixels. And if we actually want to see, if I press F, we see we have a bunch of these sizes over here. All right. You can see that the Surface Pro has a width of 960 pixels over here. So this width is 960. And if I am opening this, what I basically want is this 860 pixels to exist. All right. And here we would have 50 pixels on the left and 50 pixels on the right. Right. That's about it. I didn't want to have too much. Now this could have been 40 and 40 as well. If this was 40 and 40, then this I would add 20 pixels over here. So this would become 880 pixels and this also would be 880, right? So essentially what I'm doing is I'm having just one breakpoint. Just one breakpoint is going to suit all my needs, all right? Because until this point, everything is going to have a everything is going to be in this width of 860. But the moment it hits 960 and below, this is going to sort of start shrinking like this. All right. And that is fine because it's very unlikely that I would go less than 960 pixels. Right. So if I press F, I can see 960. I might come down to 744, but that's OK. Right. So if I come over here and I try another one, and here I say 744, all right. Here, I wanted to maintain 50 pixels on the left and the right, right? So I'm going to come over here and just move this over here. So 50 pixels on the left and 50 pixels on the right, right? There is not going to be any other tablet that's going to be lesser than 744 pixels, right? So I'm safe. So if I can make the content look good in this area, maybe we might split it into one column. So instead of having, one beside the other, we can just have one column and we can just have rest one below the other, right? So maybe these two would be one breakpoint. And if I can probably change the color over here, this would be another breakpoint. So essentially I would just have two breakpoints, right? The paddings would be the same, just that when I reach this breakpoint, I would have the elements one below the other instead of having a 2-column layout. So this is the structure that I'm going to be following, and I'm going to try to make everything work. And this is so simple and this is very easy, and a lot of products can be built like this. In fact, a lot of landing pages are built like this, right? So this is how I'm going to decide my layout. And as you can see, I'm not using any 12-column grid layouts, anything like that. It's just simple 2-column with a gap in the middle. I've chosen a gap of 32. I might change it to a different number later on. We'll see. We'll figure that out later. But for me, it's going to be like this. All right. So that's pretty much it for the video, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you did, let me know in the comment section down below. And I'll see you guys in the next video.